Ah, my dear friends, just think about this for a moment. One of the quietest revolutions in history starts with one person's hands. With just a few wooden blocks, a handful of metal letters, and endless imagination, a miracle is born that changes the rhythm of an entire era. You may have heard the name Johannes Gutenberg before, but today I'll show you that he was more than just a name. He was the symbol of an era that broke the chains of knowledge and freed the imagination of ordinary people. Now, close your eyes and listen. Picture a small shop in 15th century Europe. Outside, the rain is gently falling, and inside, under the dim light of a candle, a man is working. He's holding a simple yet revolutionary tool, carefully placing wooden blocks, applying ink, and writing history with every print. Who could have known in those quiet moments that he was unknowingly changing the world? But this is just the beginning. Gutenberg's invention opened the door for knowledge and ideas to reach even the farthest corners, while also setting the stage for one of the biggest turning points in human history. So, if this story begins here, where do you think it ends? Ah, my dear friends, in the mists of time, in the early 1400s, a child is born in a small town in Germany. His name is Johannes. Who could have known that this child not only would shake his hometown of Mainz, but the entire world with a revolution? Johannes Gutenberg, starting his journey of life as the son of an ordinary goldsmith, would soon realize humanity's greatest need: to free knowledge. Young Johannes stood out for his attention to detail as he learned the art of goldsmithing. He knew that working with gold and silver required patience. Each line, each design had to be flawless. It was this patience and craftsmanship that gave him the skill he would later need to create his great work. But, my friends, he didn't want to settle for goldsmithing. He had a bigger dream in mind. The quest for knowledge had become a struggle for people, as the limited number of handwritten books made access to them a difficult task. Johannes wanted to change that. Years passed, and Gutenberg matured, seeking new ways. The idea of inventing the printing press didn't come to him suddenly. He observed, experimented, and made mistakes. With every failure, he started again. He drew inspiration from the ancient Roman printing techniques, but searched for ways to improve them. At the time, the methods used in Europe were rather simple. Writings were carved onto wooden blocks, dipped in ink, and pressed onto paper. However, this method was both labor-intensive and required a new block for every new text. Gutenberg knew there had to be a more practical and effective system, and here, my dear friends, is where the brilliance of genius shone through: the movable type system. What Gutenberg did was create a system by casting each letter separately. These letters, made from a mixture of lead and tin, were both durable and reusable. By putting the letters together, you could create any text, and after finishing, you could rearrange the letters for another text. What an innovation, right? Now, it wasn't just one book, but hundreds, even thousands of books that could be produced. Of course, this process wasn't easy. Gutenberg spent years working on the printing press. Inspired by wooden presses, he designed a mechanism that evenly transferred ink onto paper. When he brought all the components of the printing press together, he made that giant leap that forever changed how humans accessed knowledge. But, my dear friends, like every great invention, this one came with its challenges: financial troubles, trial and error, even lawsuits over debt. But Gutenberg didn't give up. If it hadn't been for his determination, maybe we'd be living in a very different world today. And now, think about this, my friends. Gutenberg's invention wasn't just a technological breakthrough, it was also a tool that changed the very spirit of an age. However, to truly see the revolutionary impact of this, we need to wait just a little longer. So, how did this incredible innovation of the printing press spark the flame of the Renaissance? Well, that's what our next story will be about. Ah, my dear friends, the printing press that Johannes Gutenberg developed with his movable type system was nothing short of a miracle that changed the course of human history. But this invention couldn't remain just an idea. It had to prove its power, show the world the potential it held. And that's when Gutenberg set his sights on one specific project, the printing of the Bible. It's the mid-1450s in Mainz, in a small workshop. Silence reigns. The only sounds are the rhythmic clatter of the wooden presses and the soft rustle of inked letters meeting paper. At that time, the Bible was a book that only priests and wealthy aristocrats had access to. These handwritten manuscripts often took years to complete, and thus were sold at great prices. But Gutenberg wanted to make this holy book available to everyone. He dreamed of a time when people could read the Bible in their own homes. He made a plan. He perfected the movable type system, improved the ink formula, and focused on technical details to ensure the pages were perfectly printed. Each page was carefully crafted with letters, like a rich work of art. While the advantage of the printing press was fast production, Gutenberg didn't compromise on his pursuit of perfection in his first work. Every Bible that was printed was carefully designed to resemble the handwritten books of the time. In fact, the letters and layout used on the pages were designed to mimic the delicate craftsmanship of handwritten manuscripts. By 1455, the Gutenberg Bible, the first mass-produced book in history, was completed. This was not just a book, it was a revolution. A total of 180 copies were printed, an incredible number for that era. Just imagine, creating that many Bibles by hand would have taken decades. Now, this holy text could reach a wider audience than ever before, and not just priests or kings, but ordinary people could have their hands on it as well. So, what were the effects? Ah, my friends, the Gutenberg Bible wasn't just a religious text. It was a key that opened the doors to knowledge, education, and individual thought. This book, spreading throughout Europe, encouraged people to develop the habit of reading on their own. People who could read the Bible started questioning the teachings of the church and developing their own interpretations. This was the first crack in the church's control. Knowledge, once monopolized by the clergy, was now in the hands of ordinary people. My dear friends, this book did not only demonstrate the power of the printing press, but also planted the seeds for the cultural and intellectual transformations that Europe would experience in the future. Books were no longer a luxury. They were becoming part of the public's common heritage. New printing workshops in European cities rapidly increased the number of published works. Not just the Bible, but scientific texts, philosophical writings, and even literary works began to roll off the presses. The revolution that started in Gutenberg's workshop soon spread across the entire continent. But let us not help but think, my friends, how did this innovation affect the church, the education system, and even the lives of ordinary people? How did the printing press ignite the Renaissance? Well, we'll continue our story in the next chapter to explore the answers to these questions. Ah, my dear friends, I've witnessed many discoveries that changed the course of human history, but few have seen such a powerful transformation as the liberation of knowledge through the printing press. Johannes Gutenberg's press wasn't just a technology, it was a revolution that broke the chains of knowledge, taking it beyond the narrow walls it had been trapped in. Let's imagine together how the waves of this revolution shook every corner of Europe. By the late 1450s, the first books printed from the press were still circulating in just a few cities. But those few pages were like a spark. They quickly set fire to the entire continent. Imagine, until then, knowledge could only be transported through handwritten books. This made access to knowledge a limited privilege. But the printing press accelerated book production so much that in no time, books moved from the salons of nobles into the homes of the people. Education was no longer a luxury for a minority. It was transforming into an ocean that would embrace all parts of society. And literacy, my friends, that word meant a great revolution in those days. Information once hidden in the corridors of the church and the libraries of the aristocracy was now accessible to ordinary people. This allowed the public to develop the ability to learn and think independently. People were not just reading sacred texts, but also scientific works, philosophical writings, and even new literary pieces, expanding their worlds. Knowledge, once the monopoly of a few, was now the common heritage of millions. But this change most shook the power of the church, my dear fellow. My dear friends. Think about it. Throughout the Middle Ages, knowledge was almost entirely under the control of the church. The church encouraged the sacred texts to be read only in Latin, preventing ordinary people from understanding them. However, with the spread of the printing press, texts like the Bible were being translated into the vernacular. People could now read the Holy Book directly in their own languages and develop independent thoughts, free from the church's interpretations. This was a change that shook the very foundations of authority. At the heart of this revolution, a monk named Martin Luther emerged. In 1517, he sparked the Reformation with the 95 Theses he nailed to the door of the Wittenberg church. My dear friends, Luther's action wasn't just a challenge. It was the first cry of the new age of knowledge. His critiques and proposals, printed and spread by the press, soon reached all of Europe. Luther's ideas, once thoughts that could echo only in one city, were now heard across continents. Thanks to the printing press, Protestantism became a powerful wave challenging the church's authority. Reformation ideas began to be discussed in village squares, coffee houses, and homes. People were not just reading, they were thinking critically about what they read, debating, and taking action. The rapid spread of knowledge transformed not only religion but also political and social structures. Individuals were now questioning the information provided by authorities and seeking their own answers. But my friends, there's a question we must ask. Did this revolution in knowledge only shake the power of the church, or did it also change the political balance of Europe? How did this new age, opened by the printing press, affect not just individual freedom of thought, but also the birth of nations? Well, we'll continue our journey to uncover the answers to these questions. My dear friends, humanity has always looked up at the sky, wondering what secrets lie beneath the stars, what mysteries are hidden behind this magnificent order. But for centuries, the true answers to these questions were only in the hands of a select few. And here, the miracle of the printing press made its impact once again. Knowledge was no longer confined within the stone walls of monasteries or the libraries of the nobility. It became a free power circulating among the people. And this freedom opened the door to scientific revolutions, leading humanity into a new era. Let's go back to the world of Copernicus, our first stop. Ah, those days when people were holding on tightly to the idea that the Earth was at the center of the universe. Copernicus, after years of observation and calculations, revealed a truth that would turn this understanding upside down. The Earth revolved around the sun. His book, De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium on the revolutions of the celestial spheres, with the help of the printing press, was reproduced and spread across Europe. Once a piece of knowledge that only a small group of academics could access, it was now something anyone could discuss thanks to the printing press. Copernicus's work forever changed humanity's view of the universe. But, my friends, this was just the beginning. In this new world where scientific knowledge was spreading, bold minds like Galileo Galilei came to the forefront. Ah, Galileo, the genius who used his telescope to study the sky, discovering Jupiter's moons, observing Saturn's rings. His works were revolutionary for the public who had once only been allowed to read the information sanctioned by the church or kings. Galileo's books were quickly reproduced thanks to printing presses and soon reached every corner of Europe. This was strong proof that scientific thought could evolve independently from the church's dogmas. However, we must remember, these ideas weren't always accepted. Galileo had to face the Inquisition, but thanks to the printing press, his ideas moved faster than those who tried to silence him. The scientific revolution was not just illuminating the sky, but the earth as well. Academic knowledge could no longer be kept behind closed doors. Printing presses tore down the walls of universities and delivered knowledge into the hands of the people. Manuscripts, once only accessible to a few, were now transformed into scientific journals and books read by large crowds. During this period, groundbreaking discoveries were made in fields ranging from anatomy to physics, chemistry to engineering. Works like Vesalius's detailed studies on human anatomy and Harvey's writings on the circulation of blood. These became not just scientific works, but tools that reshape societies, all thanks to the power of the printing press. So, my friends, think about this. If, at such a powerful time for the printing press, scientific knowledge had not moved beyond the control of the rich and elite to reach the people, what path would humanity have followed? Could the scientific revolution have progressed so quickly? But the next question is even bigger. The printing press didn't just change science, it also transformed politics and society. How did this change prepare Europe for a transformation that would last for centuries? Well, we'll be looking for the answer to this question in the next chapter. Ah, my dear friends, let's lift the foggy veils of time and travel to one of the most exciting periods in human history, the dawn of the Renaissance. Just the name itself sounds like a fairy tale, rebirth. But I must tell you, it didn't just suddenly shine like a star in the sky. No. The Renaissance grew slowly, like a seed cracking open in the dark soil, searching for the sun. And the roots of this great transformation take us thousands of years back to the glory of ancient Greece and Rome, the wisdom of the ancient world. Back in those days, philosophers, artists, and scientists pushed the boundaries of humanity. Socrates' quest for wisdom, Plato's ideal state utopia, Aristotle's efforts to understand the universe, and Rome's magnificent architecture, legal systems, and literature. But all this grandeur had been lost in the darkness of the Middle Ages, right? Still, that wisdom didn't completely vanish. It was preserved in the silent libraries of monasteries, safeguarded in the Arab world. And then, in 14th century Italy, it reemerged. Italy, oh beautiful Italy, it became the cradle of this rebirth. But why Italy, you might ask? The answer is actually simple, but fascinating. Italy was the heart of the Roman Empire. The glory of the ancient world still echoed in its stones and soil. Roman ruins, statues, ancient manuscripts. The Italians were sitting on a treasure, but to recognize this treasure and begin to shape it, a spark was needed. And that spark came from the city of Florence. Ah, Florence. This city was one of Europe's cultural and commercial centers at the time. But what made Florence truly special was the Medici family. This family wasn't just wealthy from banking. They were the greatest supporters of art, science, and culture. Cosimo de' Medici, like a sage from the ancient world, worked passionately to carry the legacy of the past into the future. In the family's palace, ancient manuscripts were collected, translations were made, and Florence quickly became a hub of thought and art. The city was adorned with Dante's verses, Botticelli's brushstrokes, and Brunelleschi's architectural wonders. But this wasn't just Florence's dream, it was all of Italy's. The great admiration for ancient Greece and Rome didn't just reshape art and literature, it also transformed architecture, science, and even the way society viewed the world. People didn't just learn this ancient wisdom, they reinterpreted it, took it to the next level. The Renaissance person developed an understanding that built on the past and shaped the future. That's why the Renaissance wasn't just a period, it was a revolution. So, my friends, think for a moment. If there hadn't been brave supporters like the Medici family, could this great rebirth have happened? And was the impact of the Renaissance limited to just art and thought? In the next chapter, we'll explore how the Renaissance inspired scientific revolutions, discoveries, and new worlds. Are you ready? Ah, my dear friends, art is a mirror that reflects the soul of humanity, isn't it? Now, let's take another step into the magical atmosphere of the Renaissance and explore how it revolutionized art. Artists, inspired by the grandeur of the ancient world but going beyond it to chart a new path, changed the course of history. These artists didn't just create magnificent paintings and sculptures, they managed to capture humanity, nature, and the essence of life in a way that had never been seen before. So, how did they do it? The answer lies in the magical touch of perspective and realism. To understand Renaissance art, we must first understand the innovation at its heart. Perspective. Perspective, my dear friends, allows you to step into a painting. Before, art was mostly expressed with symbols and flat surfaces. But Renaissance artists created a revolution with their understanding of depth and volume. This technique, which made you feel like you were looking out at the world through a window, made the viewer a part of the artwork. Filippo Brunelleschi was the first master of perspective. Can you imagine how this mathematical discovery of his inspired artists as he walked through the narrow streets of Florence? And then came Leonardo da Vinci. Ah, Leonardo, his name alone evokes genius, doesn't it? This man wasn't just a painter, but also an inventor and a scientist. He masterfully combined perspective and realism in his art. Think of The Last Supper. With your eyes, you can see the emotions on the faces of the disciples sitting at the table, almost as if you can hear their conversations. He used light and shadow so skillfully that his works became more than just paintings. They became slices of life. But Leonardo's art wasn't limited to technique. He sought to understand the human soul. In his works, you can see the movement of muscles, the expressions on faces, and life itself. Speaking of Leonardo, how could we forget Michelangelo? This master sculptor and painter represents the pinnacle of Renaissance art. When you see Michelangelo's David, you can't help but wonder how such a living human figure could be created from a block of stone. It's almost as if blood flows through its veins, as if it breathes. Michelangelo didn't just depict divine figures. He also captured both the weaknesses and strengths of humanity. His works, while imbuing divine meaning, also displayed the perfect complexity of being human. But Renaissance art didn't just elevate divinity. These artists also brought everyday life and ordinary people into their works. The game of a child in the street, the bustle of the market, or a mother's love for her child. All of these were signs that art was no longer just sacred, but was approaching humanity. The Renaissance brought art into the lives of the people, the dust of the streets, the breath of humans, and thus, art became something that wasn't just for the nobles, but something everyone could understand and appreciate. My friends, Renaissance art, with its perspective and realism, didn't just affect our eyes, it deeply impacted our souls. So, was all this great change just the beginning? How did this new perspective change not only art, but also science, thought, and even the very structure of society? In the next chapter, we'll search for the answer to this question. Are you ready? My friends. Now, let's dive once more into the deep waters of the Renaissance. This time, we'll shift our focus from the grandeur of art to the exciting discoveries of science. The Renaissance didn't just transform art. It radically changed the way humans thought, how we understood the world, and how we explored the universe. At the center of this change was an approach that redefined humanity, viewing it as both a part of nature and a discoverer of the cosmos. This was the birth of human-centered thinking, a revolution known at the time as humanism. My dear friends, this new way of thinking gave humans both pride and responsibility. Throughout the Middle Ages, knowledge was largely based on the authority of God and sacred texts. People saw themselves not as the center of the universe, but as a small part of a divine order. However, with the Renaissance came the idea that humans could understand nature through their own minds and abilities. Humans were no longer just readers of sacred texts. They were now authors attempting to write the book of the universe. It was an incredible transformation. It was like the door of a dark room opening and the light from outside flooding in. So, how did this new thought emerge? To understand that, we need to look at the works of the scientists of the time. Nature was no longer seen merely as a part of a divine order, but as something to be studied, measured, and understood. There was a brave man named Nicholas Copernicus. It would be unfair not to tell his story. Copernicus observed the sky and made an incredible discovery. The Earth was not the center of the universe. Challenging the beliefs of his time, he proposed a system where the sun was at the center. Do you think this was just a scientific discovery? No, my dear friends. This was also a revolutionary way of thinking that led humanity to question its place in the cosmos. And then came Galileo Galilei. Ah, Galileo. Imagine the excitement he must have felt while looking at the stars through his telescope. That simple telescope he built with his own hands opened up the sky like a curtain of secrets. When he saw the craters on the moon's surface, he realized that it was not a symbol of divine perfection, but a celestial body just like Earth. When he observed the moons of Jupiter, he understood that the universe was far more complex than we had thought. Galileo's observations not only expanded the boundaries of science, but also of human thought. Renaissance scientific thinking didn't just change our view of the sky, it also gave nature a new perspective. Instead of relying on sacred texts, the method of understanding nature became rooted in experimentation and observation. One of the most important representatives of this approach was the English philosopher Francis Bacon. He laid the foundations for the scientific method, and with his famous words, "Knowledge is power," he proposed that by understanding nature, humans could control it. This idea was yet another reflection of the Renaissance's human-centered approach. Humans were no longer just a part of nature, but could be its guide. My friends, this new way of thinking not only brought scientific discoveries, but also added a new dimension to humanity's self-confidence. Humans began to believe that they could solve the secrets of the universe and read the language of nature. So, what kind of era did these bold thoughts open the door to? How did the scientific revolution of the Renaissance pave the way for the Industrial Revolution and the birth of modern science? Let's meet in the next chapter to search for the answer to this question. Are you ready? My dear friends, now imagine this. Rare books once written on parchment are being replaced by paper pages that anyone can access. The invention of the printing press didn't just change the world of thought, it completely transformed the soul of art. Art was no longer confined to walls, frescoes, or the dim rooms of palaces. It now found its place in everyone's hands, homes, and even minds. Let's explore the fascinating story of this transformation together. At first, the printing press was seen as a tool for duplicating books, but its impact on the art world grew far deeper over time. Engraving became a technique that rose to prominence, enabling art to reach the masses. Now, close your eyes and think about this. An artist carefully etches a design onto a metal plate. Then, they cover the plate with ink and press it onto a sheet of paper. This simple process allowed hundreds of copies of a masterpiece to be created. Think of the works of Albrecht Dürer, one of the most famous engravers of the time. The intricate details in his depictions of animals, or the extraordinary depth with which he presented religious scenes, left not only the rich but also ordinary people in awe. Another effect of the printing press on art was the rise of illustrated books. Books, once limited to words, were now brought to life with visuals. This didn't just make access to information easier, it also sparked the imagination. Religious texts, like the Bible, were now printed with engravings. People were now able to see the stories of the holy texts not just in words, but in pictures. These works, where art met the sacred, left a deep imprint on the minds of the people. However, these illustrated books weren't limited to religious themes. Engravings depicting mythology, history, and daily life played both an educational and entertaining role. And, my dear friends, amidst all of this, another important development occurred. the birth of art criticism. The printing press didn't just spread works of art, it also spread the ideas written about these works. People began discussing the beauty of a painting, the elegance of a sculpture, or the meaning of a piece of art. The art critiques written at the time didn't just guide artists. They also educated the eyes of the viewers. Art was no longer just an experience of seeing. It became an opportunity to understand and reflect. Critiques opened the door to aesthetic discussions and paved the way for the redefinition of art's value and purpose. My dear friends, the transformative effect of the printing press on art didn't just lay the foundation for the Renaissance. It also formed one of the cornerstones of modern art. As art spread to the masses, a new wave of inspiration born from the people emerged. But there's a question we need to ask. When art became so widely accessible to the public, how did the role of the artist transform? As art moved out of the hands of a small elite and became the property of everyone, how did the identity of the artist and the meaning of art change? Let's search for the answer to this question in the next chapter. Are you ready? Ah, my dear friends, now let me take you down the dusty roads of time to the days when the printing press spread across the European continent. This is not just the story of an invention, but the beginning of a cultural transformation that shook the old continent to its very roots. What started in the small workshop of Johannes Gutenberg in Mainz sparked a revolution that spread like wildfire across Europe. But it didn't happen overnight. It took time, resistance, and patience. And this process unfolded in different ways from country to country. Let's first look at Italy, one of the hottest hubs of the printing press. Florence, Venice, Rome. These cities were where the pulse of the Renaissance was beating. People were resurrecting the ancient knowledge of Greece and Rome, and new ideas were sprouting. When Gutenberg's invention reached the Italians, imagine how it gave wings to art and literature. Masters like Aldus Manutius used the press not just as a tool for spreading knowledge, but also for promoting art and aesthetics. Books printed in Venice included not only texts, but also elegantly illustrated pages. This was a time when books were no longer just carriers of knowledge, but of beauty as well. But, my dear friends, the printing press was expanding the boundaries of not only art, but also knowledge. In Germany, the birthplace of the press, scientific works began to proliferate rapidly. Luther's 95 Theses were one of the first examples that fully demonstrated the power of Gutenberg's invention. People were now questioning not just what they heard, but what they read. Every book, every line was a seed of thought. These seeds spread beyond Germany's borders to countries like England and France. When we get to England, we must mention another key figure in the history of the printing press, William Caxton. He was behind the first books printed in England. The printing press he set up in London opened up English literature to the public. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales began to spread through the power of the press. Imagine, people who had only heard these stories orally for centuries could now read them with their own eyes. And think about it, this wasn't just a literary revolution, but also a movement for social equality. In France, we see another impact of the printing press, the rapid spread of ideas. Intellectuals in the universities of Paris began working with the new possibilities provided by the press. Works on science, philosophy, and religion were circulating not just among the elite, but among ordinary people as well. Now, knowledge was no longer the monopoly of the nobility and the church. Libraries were growing. Coffee houses were turning into reading rooms. From France's villages to its palaces, books began to reach all levels of society. But, my dear friends, one of the most striking aspects of this revolution was how it reduced the knowledge gap between social classes. Before, it was rare for a peasant to even see a book. But now, books were sold in markets, shops, and even inns. Everyone could breathe in the scent of knowledge. Books were made not from expensive parchment, but from cheap paper, making them more accessible. This wasn't just the beginning of a revolution, it was the start of an equality movement. Now, dear friends, I must tell you that this story doesn't end here. The revolution that spread across Europe not only disseminated knowledge, but also sowed the seeds of conflict. The power of the printing press made it possible for ideas to circulate freely, but it also raised the question of who would control these ideas: the church, the nobility, and the rising bourgeoisie. They all tried to use this new power to their advantage. So, how did this power struggle end? What conflicts did the ideas spread by the printing press lead to in Europe? Ah, my friends, I'll tell you all about that in the next story, because this is just the beginning. Ah, my dear friends, now let me take you to a time when the light of knowledge began to shine in the sky like a star, to the golden days of the Renaissance. A revolution was taking place at the heart of time. Not only art and science, but also the education of the human mind was part of this revolution. These years were when the modern education system took root and grew. It would be unfair to see this as just a period, because the Renaissance was a storm of thought that changed the course of human history, beginning in the lavish cities of Italy and spreading across Europe. This awakening led to an explosion of universities and schools which seemed to appear like stars in the sky. Florence, Padua, Bologna. The universities established in these cities became fortresses of Renaissance thought. The texts from the ancient world were being reread, examined, and even questioned. The hunger for knowledge was so great that the roads leading to these schools were seen as pilgrimage paths. People no longer wanted to settle for local knowledge. They were drawing inspiration from the ancient wisdom of Greece and Rome. But, my friends, these universities weren't just for the elites. During this period, the number of schools for the public grew rapidly. The spirit of the Renaissance whispered that knowledge should not belong to just one group of people. These new schools were established to serve different segments of society. Churches, monasteries, and even wealthy merchants started opening schools to help more people learn to read and write. Education was no longer the monopoly of the rich or the nobles. Ordinary people were beginning to share in this enlightenment. At the heart of this educational explosion was the power of the printing press. The great invention of Gutenberg not only increased the number of books, but also helped standardize knowledge. Imagine, once copying a book by hand took years. Who knows how many mistakes were made, how much information was passed on incorrectly. But now, thanks to the press, each book was identical to the next. This made the creation of textbooks possible. Now, the texts used for teaching could be standardized. A student in Paris could study at a university, and another in Oxford could read the same book. This allowed knowledge to spread like a global language, especially in fields like mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. The first printed textbooks led the way in making learning systematic. For example, Euclid's Elements, a geometry book, became a foundational text used in nearly every school across Europe during the Renaissance. This book wasn't just a math textbook. It also taught how to think logically and systematically. Thus, people weren't just learning how to access knowledge, they were also learning how to use it. But my friends, this revolution wasn't always easy. The rapid spread of knowledge caused discomfort among those who supported the old order. In ancient times, those who held knowledge were the ones in power. Now, however, this power was spreading to society as a whole. Some groups began to see the standardization of knowledge as a threat. Authorities in the church and the nobility, who wanted to control knowledge, didn't know how to cope with this new order. But I ask you, my friends, could this great revolution in education completely change society? What kind of transformation would the standardization of knowledge and the growing number of schools bring to the minds of the people? The answer to this question is hidden in our next story. Stay tuned and see. My friends, now let me take you to a time that expanded the horizons of the world and turned mankind's dreams into reality. The age of the printing press and discoveries. Back then, humanity wasn't just exploring the boundaries of the land, but also the limits of imagination. Geographic discoveries started as a whisper, but soon became a shout that traveled across continents. Yet, this story wasn't just about the brave explorers' journeys across the seas. There was another force that carried the sound of these discoveries far and wide and presented this exciting knowledge to people like treasures. The printing press. Imagine, my dear friends, in the early 15th century, the world was still covered by a sea of darkness and the unknown. People were curious about what lay beyond the horizon, but getting accurate information was quite difficult. It was precisely at this point that both the geographic discoveries and the printing press started to turn the wheels of history together. Great events like Christopher Columbus discovering America or Vasco da Gama finding the sea route to India weren't small occurrences that would be forgotten after being passed around by a few people. These discoveries needed to be told, spread, and change the world. And that's where the printing press came in. When Columbus discovered the New World, this event didn't just echo in the Spanish court. Thanks to the power of the printing press, this discovery was soon heard across Europe. Stories that had been limited to oral traditions were now being written down and reproduced. Columbus's letters spoke of new lands, imaginary cities full of gold, and a whole new world. These printed documents didn't just fuel the imagination, they also shared the excitement of the discoveries. Now, a peasant, a merchant, or a noble could read all about these great adventures and imagine how vast the world was. And my friends, the maps, they were some of the most valuable treasures of the time. Sailors and explorers would draw the lands, seas, and stars they encountered on their journeys. These maps weren't just guides, they were works of art. But imagine, when these maps were drawn by hand, they were seen and used by very few people. The contribution of the printing press to this field was extraordinary. Maps were now reproduced, reaching every port town and royal palace. As sailors set sail into the unknown, they found security in the maps they held in their hands. Another example was the printing of the manuscripts of Portuguese explorers. The knowledge and maps gathered at Prince Henry's Naval Academy were spread among the public thanks to the printing press. These documents were priceless, not just for sailors, but also for merchants seeking new trade routes, new ports, new products, new wealth. People, armed with the information printed by the press, were gaining access to opportunities they couldn't have dreamed of before. However, the combination of the printing press and the discoveries didn't just spread knowledge, it also fueled competition. A discovery report printed in one country would quickly reach another, sparking fierce competition between different kingdoms: the Spanish, the Portuguese, the English, and the Dutch. They all wanted to use the information provided by the printing press for their own interests. Every map, every logbook could be the key to the next great discovery. But friends, I ask you, with all this accumulation of knowledge, how far could humanity progress? What other great transformations would the printed maps and discovery stories lead to? The answer to this question is hidden in my next story. Stay tuned and see. My dear friends, the story of the printing press wasn't only about serving science, art, and discoveries. This magnificent invention also found itself in the very heart of religious wars, in an arena where words were as sharp as swords. Now let me take you to the fierce propaganda battle between the Catholic and Protestant churches. This was a time when not only beliefs, but also ideas, fears, and hopes were shaped with ink. Since the late 15th century, Europe had been shaken by religious debates. Martin Luther's famous 95 Theses, nailed to the door of Wittenberg Church in 1517, was just a spark. But that spark, with the power of the printing press, became a fire that engulfed all of Europe. Imagine this: Luther's critiques, without the printing press, might have stayed within the borders of just one region, whispered among a few clergymen, and forgotten. But the inked gears of the press quickly copied, reproduced, and carried those words to distant lands. Ideas that were once confined to church walls now echoed in every village square, in every noble's mansion. The Catholic Church couldn't ignore this challenge. To defend their views and respond to Luther's writings, they started using the same weapon, the printing press. Books, pamphlets, and brochures were printed one after the other, with theologians financed by the church trying to disprove Luther's false ideas. But here's the irony, my friends. The printing press's impartial gears didn't care whose writings they were reproducing. Catholic propaganda spread just as quickly as the Protestants, and both sides were attacking each other with words. In the streets of Europe, peasants and merchants alike held the documents of this ideological battle in their hands, reading by the light of their night lamps, deciding which side to believe. But it wasn't just about propaganda. The printing press also allowed individuals to read the Bible in their own languages. Another of Luther's great revolutions was translating the Bible into German. With the help of the printing press, these Bibles quickly reached a wide audience. People could now read the holy texts without depending on the church and could shape their own beliefs. This was one of the greatest steps towards religious freedom. However, this freedom also brought about conflict. The ideological rifts between churches fueled social unrest, and religious wars broke out across Europe. But my friends, the impact of the printing press didn't just stay within sacred texts and ideological battles. With the Renaissance, the ink droplets from the press also began to change the fabric of everyday life. Once reserved for the nobility and clergy, the concepts of elegance and aesthetics were now intertwined with the knowledge spread by the press and began to seep into the lives of ordinary people. Fashion, at the time, was not just about clothing, but also a symbol of status. The printing press popularized fashion trends. Design sketches and fabric patterns were printed and sent across Europe. Now, even a peasant could sew a simpler version of the garments worn by nobles and get a glimpse of that grandeur. When it came to architecture, the reflection of the Renaissance spirit in everyday life was fascinating. Thanks to the printing press, architectural plans and design principles spread far and wide, influencing not just massive cathedrals, but also ordinary homes. People learned about Italian architects' elegant designs from books and applied them in their own towns. As Europe's cities took shape with this new understanding, the traces of the Renaissance became visible in every stone and column and theater. Ah, my dear friends, in the Renaissance, theater wasn't just entertainment. It was a cultural revolution. The works of geniuses like Shakespeare were reproduced with the power of the printing press and spread across Europe. Theater texts were no longer the monopoly of actors, but also in the hands of readers. These works turned into cultural treasures for the public. A theatergoer watching a play at London's Globe Theatre could buy the same play the next day from a local bookstore and read it again at home. My friends, the printing press literally changed life. Religion, art, architecture, and daily life all benefited from this revolution. But I can't help but ask, was this transformation just the beginning? What other revolutions might the information revolution sparked by the printing press herald in the coming centuries? Well, we'll explore this in the next story. Stay tuned. Ah, my dear friends, the printing press was a revolution. It had begun an era of freedom for both knowledge and thought. But like every revolution, it brought with it its own conflicts, crises, and pains. The printing press had been a beacon of hope for information-hungry masses, but that light had blinded some and frightened others. The church and the kingdoms had started to feel uneasy about the uncontrolled spread of this new power. After all, knowledge can be even more dangerous than a sword, and the printing press had put that sword in everyone's hands. First, the church took action. Throughout the Middle Ages, the church had been the greatest guardian of knowledge and, most often, its only authority. But with the advent of the printing press, they began to feel their authority shaking. Everyone now had a Bible in hand, and everyone had their own interpretation. This was nothing less than chaos for the church. Thus, the Index of Forbidden Books was created. These lists contained texts that the church deemed dangerous. Especially the writings of the Reformation movement were kept from the public at all costs. But here, my friends, human nature's stubborn spirit kicked in. The more forbidden something was, the stronger the curiosity became. Books were secretly printed, underground presses were set up, and forbidden texts were passed hand to hand in the darkness of the night. The kings were also dissatisfied. The printing press not only threatened the church's authority, but also that of absolute monarchies. A king's decrees were supposed to be engraved in stone tablets, never to be questioned. But with the rise of printing, not only the king's words, but also the people's words multiplied. Political critiques, opposing views, and even calls for rebellion were no longer written on scrolls, but on books with hundreds of copies. In response, many rulers across Europe tried to increase their control over printing. A licensing system was introduced, allowing presses to operate only with royal permission. But still, secret presses worked day and night, keeping the spark of free thought alive. But my friends, it was impossible to stop this creative spirit under pressure. The printing press didn't just resist censorship, it also became the carrier of the Renaissance and political changes that deeply transformed Europe. The human-centered philosophy of the Renaissance quickly spread with the power of the printing press. People could now read not only the Holy Scriptures, but also the works of philosophers, the theories of scientists, and the thoughts of artists. This explosion of knowledge impacted every part of society and completely changed Europe's intellectual landscape. And then, my friends, we witnessed the birth of nation-states. The printing press shaped not only individual minds, but also the collective consciousness of societies. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Europe shed its feudal structure and stepped into the age of nation-states. The printing press played a crucial role in the formation of these new states. Propaganda had become a monarch's most powerful weapon. National identities were shaped by the stories, epics, and histories spread by the press. An Italian would read Machiavelli's The Prince and learn the new rules of politics. A Frenchman would read poems praising the splendor of his kingdom. An Englishman would define his national character through Shakespeare's plays. In the face of the transformative power of the printing press, I can't help but ask, my friends, how far could humanity go in this new age of knowledge? With individuals expressing their thoughts more freely and nations in search of a collective identity, what would the next step bring? The answers to these questions are hidden in the great revolutions of the coming centuries. And together, we will explore the story of these revolutions in the next chapter. Ah, my dear friends, now we've reached the end of this epic tale. It's impossible to complete this journey without reflecting on how the printing press and the Renaissance together left a legacy on human history. Imagine that the people walking the streets of that era, touching books and putting their thoughts to paper, may not have even realized they were part of a revolution. Yet, through their efforts, the foundations of the modern world were being laid. The legacy of the printing press and the Renaissance was not just an explosion of knowledge. It was the opening of a door to an era that pushed the boundaries of the human mind. The intellectual awakening of the Renaissance, combined with the spreading power of the printing press, laid the groundwork for the modern age. From mathematics to physics, medicine to philosophy, humanity took huge steps forward. Knowledge was no longer in the hands of only nobles, priests, or kings. Even an ordinary farmer had the right to learn. Universities flourished with the support of the printing press. Libraries overflowed. Galileo's observations reaching for the stars, Kepler's calculations of planetary motions, Newton's revolutionary laws of physics, all of these were the fruits of the knowledge network woven by the printing press. But my friends, the legacy of the printing press was not limited to science. Societies changed, and so did people. The sparks of the Enlightenment were ignited by the ideas springing from the pages of printed books. Concepts like human rights, freedom, and equality were born in the spaces between the lines of books and pamphlets. Revolutions were shaped by the echoes of the printing press. America's fight for independence, the ideals of the French Revolution, all blossomed in the light of this written legacy. The printing press didn't just carry information, it also carried the will of humanity to determine its own destiny. And now, my dear listeners, when you look at the modern world, can you see the ancient spirit of the printing press? The digital texts we read on our smartphones, the vast pool of knowledge on the internet, aren't they all just the continuation of the work once done by those simple wooden printing presses? The printing press turned humanity's desire to learn, share, and progress into a lasting legacy. The transformation it brought to human history is still with us, no matter how much time passes. But my friends, what will humanity do with this legacy? With the power to spread knowledge in our hands, will we use it as a unifying bridge or as a divisive weapon? The answer to these questions lies with the new bearers of this legacy, us. We wrap up our story here, but the journey through history never ends. I hope we meet again in another time, in another story. Remember, the voice of history never falls silent, as long as there are ears willing to hear it.